What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and a lot of you guys have been screaming at me to make videos on Y the Last Man, which makes sense. I absolutely love Y the Last Man. God, it's so incredibly good. It's one of my absolute favorite stories, right? It's written by Brian K. Vaughan. Of course, the TV show's coming out soon. It's absolutely fantastic, right? So we're gonna do a little bit of a taster here, kind of cover the first 2 issues and just see what you guys think. So here's the thing, a lot actually happens in these first 2 issues, which is one of the other reasons why we're breaking it down into a more digestible size, because things pop off fast, like super fast. Initially, we open up here with a conversation between York and Beth. Now, York, as you guys can probably guess, is a star of the comic. Beth is his girlfriend who's actually in the Australian outback. Now, the conversation between the two is fairly lighthearted, right? It's just them kind of generally having a conversation, talking about the idea of destiny, him being disappointed by the fact that he didn't get the job that he was applying for. But one of the other important things that's really shown here is that Yorick is basically an escape artist, and it really seems more of a hobby than anything else, right? It's not really what he seems to be doing for a living, but ultimately, given the kind of cash he has, he'll be fine for the month, right? He'll have to live on ramen noodles, which, in all honesty, which of us have not had to struggle with that, right? Like back before I was a YouTuber, there was a point where I spent a whole month drinking Kool-Aid and eating bologna sandwiches, right? Like I was broke. It was rough. And so again, the conversation between York and Beth is pretty lighthearted. Not a whole lot going on there, at least not yet anyway. We switch over to a woman named Congressman Brown. Now, Congressman Brown is ultimately met by, or really kind of having a conversation with a senator. And in reality, this is just politics in Washington as usual, right? That in this instance, she's being called on to, vote for a piece of legislation. She refuses to do so. The Democrats are pissed off at her because of it, and so on and so forth. But it's one of those things where it just seems to be, just kind of political bickering and so on and so forth. But the senator's called away by the President of the United States regarding something called 355. Now, 355 is a really cool concept because what this does is it basically picks up in Al-Karak, Jordan. And you end up having this woman there who's basically, all dressed in black and some secretive looking gear, garb, so on and so forth. And that's 355, right? That's who this woman is. Now, the idea is that there's been a doctor who's been in this place for months and months and months. And there seems to have been a series of experiments and whatnot that were taking place here. But the overall gist is that because of the work of what she's been doing, they're ultimately tracking her down. And basically they're going to try to kill her. Now, the only real motivation we're given for why it is that they are doing what they're doing is because they in effect want the amulet around her neck, which is referred to as the Amulet of Helene. We don't really know the significance of it. We're not really given any major explanation as to why this is the case, but seemingly a couple of these guys end up coming in here and then killing this girl, and then 355 of course takes both of those guys out, and in effect her mission is kind of a failure, right? And in fact, she actually gets a hold of the president and says like there's going to be a delay in basically what this mission was. Now at that point, we switch over to a woman named Dr. Mann, and Dr. Mann is a really interesting situation here, right? That she's basically in the process of going into labor, and while she says she's not due for another few weeks, she's getting to the point where like she's about to pop, you know what I mean? Like that baby's about to come out. And so she's actually met by one of her former students who basically says, okay, look, like we can deliver this baby, is the father here? And that's when you learn that she is the father insofar as she cloned herself and she's basically giving birth to her own clone, which is really kind of weird. And I'm sure violates a million ethics laws just in the realm of science, not to say anything about like criminal law. So it's kind of crazy, but nonetheless, at the end of the day, just really it seems more out of loyalty than anything else. Her former student is like, okay, fine, we can do this, but we can't necessarily do it here. And that's how a lot of this stuff unfolds, right? These kind of stories, it's small little moments, small little introductory pieces, and then it all pops off, right? Like literally like 5 seconds ago, 4 seconds ago, 3 seconds ago, 2 seconds ago, literally all these people just kind of going about, right? You end up having York who asked Beth to marry him. You have you have Senator Brown who's just kind of, frustrated and dealing with politics as usual. She's told that her husband's going to be a little bit late to the party that's going on tonight, right? You have all these things happening. You've got 355 with her escort who's flying what looks like the helicopter. I mean, you have Dr. Mann who's giving birth to her baby, and then suddenly every man dies, right? Just boom, just like that, right? They all just pow, just start bleeding at the mouth and falling over. And I mean, it happens within moments, but here's the crazy thing. It's not just men. Everything with the Y chromosome dies, right? Like every animal, every mammal, the whole 9 yards, right? I mean, there's this little girl who's holding, this little cow, right? She calls a buck, and like, or maybe it's a pig. It looks like a cow, right? She's surrounded by cows. Kind of hard to tell, but maybe it's a dog. I don't know. Regardless, she's like, it's dead, right? Like this male animal that we have is dead, right? Soccer players, teachers, and this is the crazy thing about this, right? It's everything everything from just like the average person shopping in a grocery store all the way up to like the guys who run NASA, right? Like every man across the world has seemingly just died instantaneously, right? Half the population's just gone overnight. And so what you end up doing here is you pick up 2 months later, right? With this kind of cloaked figure who's just sort of walking through Washington, DC, and actually almost gets hit by somebody driving a dump truck, which is kind of nuts. But then of course, this person gets out and you end up finding out that what had happened is these various bodies in the back of this garbage truck had basically fallen out. And that's kind of the crazy thing here, is that it's only been 2 months since all the men in the world basically died, and things seem to have deteriorated rapidly fast. And the funny thing about that is that seems pretty accurate, right? I mean, I don't really know enough, in terms of studying like, anthropological results of like human, societal collapse. I don't really know exactly how that would unfold. I mean, I've seen as many movies as you guys have, like Dawn of the Dead in 2006, right? Zombies rise up and the world collapses in like 3 days. I've seen all those different movies. I honestly don't know exactly how it would unfold, but here's the thing to understand here, and it's one of the crazy things, is that what they ended up doing was basically turning the local stadium into a crematorium. And so people are basically being paid to bring bodies out there, which does make sense, right? It makes sense that they would do that, right? That they would say, okay, like there's a lot of dead men out there. We just got to bring their bodies here. So in effect, society's given up on trying to find a way to bring these men back. Now, 2 months out from when every man seemingly died, even if there was a way to bring these guys back, their brains are long since dead, right? So if you manage to find a way to resuscitate these guys, right, they're going to be turnips. That's basically what they're going to be. So there wouldn't really be any benefit to bringing these guys, not to mention the fact that they've already started decomposing. One of the other things that kind of goes on here is, of course, this girl's basically toting a handgun, and she talks about how she got it after her boyfriend was murdered, which takes this person by surprise because they're like, wait a minute, what? Like your boyfriend? Like I thought all the men were dead. And she's like, no. And she really explains in saying that her boyfriend wasn't really a guy, that it was a woman who had transitioned into a guy. But that makes sense, right? Because when you're talking about something like this, right, we as human beings, we do not like the unfamiliar. We love familiarity, we love routine, we love the pleasure and the comfort that comes with repetition, right? We don't like it when things change, because when things change, it means we have to adapt. More so than that, it's scary, right? Change is usually scary. And so the result of this is it would make perfect sense. People would try to find some way to return to the status quo. And I would wager it's probably not the only instance, right? That's kind of happening all over the country. And so of course she ends up opening this little tote container that this person's carrying with them, which is revealed to be a monkey. And then of course the monkey pulls the mask off the person's face, and we end up finding out it's York. And so basically people are starting to learn that York is alive. Now, once that happens, you switch over to Alexandria, Virginia, and you basically pick up with Agent 355, who literally comes smashing into this house, right? Like smashes through the doors and the whole 9 yards. And the person inside is kind of like, okay, like what in the hell's going on here? Like if you're looking for food, like the refrigerator and everything's already been pillaged and all that, right? And so of course this person has just recently taken up residence here. And that's when we end up learning that this is the Secretary of Agriculture, right? And she's like, I mean, I guess I'm the Secretary of Agriculture, but like most of the farmers and the livestock are all dead, right? Like our society was largely ran by men. And in the absence of those men, our society is collapsing astronomically fast because we can't do all the stuff that they did, right? We don't have the knowledge they had. Like we don't know how to run that kind of agricultural infrastructure. And so it's one of those things where, when 355 says like your title is no longer Secretary of the Agriculture, you're now the President of the United States. The response here from the Secretary is no, that doesn't make any sense, right? There's the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, President pro tempore of the Senate, Secretaries of State, Treasury, and Defense, the Attorney General. So like 355 is like, yeah, they were all men and they're all dead. The only exception was the Secretary of the Interior, and she died. Like she's supposed to be next in line, but like she died in one of the crashes, right? So like you are now next in line as President of the United States, right? You're the one who's going to be running the country now. And so 355 is like, I am part of what is in effect a kind of secretive executive branch-based organization that's referred to as the Culper Ring. And this is kind of crazy because the Culper Ring belonged to George Washington. It hasn't existed since the Revolutionary War. The fact that it exists now, or may have always existed, really even takes the Secretary of Agriculture by surprise. Like this is crazy. But the question's asked by 355, are you still willing to serve? Are you still willing to do this? And so at this point, we switch back over to York. Right now, York hanging out with this girl and talking to her, of course, basically saying like, yeah, I'm a guy. Like she literally reaches down his pants to verify that he's an actual guy. And she's like, I mean, you're a real man. Just barely. But she's like, you're a real guy, right? So like she reaches down his pants, right? Like she basically sexually assaults him to verify that he's an actual guy. And then in turn, she's like, I'm gonna sell you. Like it's not even one of these things where it's just like, oh my God, like, oh my God, you're gonna save us. The world's better. Come on, we got to get you to a safe place. We got to get you to like this science, this science division or something like that. They can find out what's going on with you. She's like, no, put on these handcuffs. I'm gonna sell you, right? Like there's some guys down the road mode who are giving people food and resources based on the value of the things that they have to offer. And in all honesty, I could probably sell you for enough food to last me a lifetime, like right off the bat, right? So this kind of moral high ground, this idea that people in times of like desperation like this would do the right thing and treat each other with care and respect, that's gone, right? That's not what's happening here, right? It's basically well, I wouldn't say every man for himself, it's every woman for herself. It's really kind of how this is given to us, right? Just human beings being human beings. Of course, because York has dabbled in escape artistry, he gets out of the handcuffs. Right, so she had no idea what she was doing, but he ultimately comes across the White House. Now at that point, you pick up with Representative Brown, who's kind of making her way through there, and of course you have what's left of the Secret Service, protecting her as best she can. And then in turn, you have, Secretary Brown, who's basically kind of crashing there for the night because she's like, I mean, look, there's not a whole lot of power. There really isn't any power anywhere, but like, I mean, this place is a palace compared to where I was living. Because I imagine that given where Secretary Brown was, because of the fact that a lot of senators and really every government official outside of the President of the United States and the President's personal family usually crashes or usually has homes in other places, and most likely took off to those homes when the government basically began to collapse, that their homes were raided by average people who were just going through and snatching up resources and so on and so forth, doing what they could to survive. And so of course, that's why you've got Representative Brown who's just staying here. The problem is, once she gets into where she's going to be sleeping at, York shows up. And that's when you find out York is the son of Representative Brown. And that's the reason why we kind of covered her a little bit at the beginning of the story. That's one of the significant things here. There were a couple of characters that we didn't cover that will become somewhat quasi-important later on. And we'll kind of go back and talk about them a little bit. But honestly, their introductions don't have any major bearing on what it is that they're doing outside of here's who they are, like here's their role in this story. But outside of that, it's kind of crazy because Representative Brown is immediately shocked by the fact that York is alive. The crazy thing about this is that there's a lot of fear and confusion out there, even for York himself, because he goes as far as to one, flip out and lose his mind once he realizes his dad is actually dead. A lot of it's regret because of the fact that he never called his dad to wish him a happy birthday. And so there's a lot of personal just grief and anger with himself that's going on there. But a lot of the fear and confusion stems from the fact that he doesn't know if he really is the last man on Earth. If there are no other men on the Earth out there, like literally nothing, like nothing with a Y chromosome, right? There's no animals, there's no people, right? Nothing like that. I mean, plants wouldn't necessarily count because they're largely asexual. If I remember my biology, right, my herbology correctly. I don't know. I failed that class when I was in high school. I had to take it in summer school, and even then, it was doing whatever I needed to do to just get through it. I didn't much care about biology. But nonetheless, it's one of these things where like he kind of talks to his mom and it's like, I asked Beth to marry me, and I don't know if she actually said yes or not because the phone's cut out before that happened. So as crazy as it sounds, the motivation of York is to actually go to Australia, right, where he knows Beth to be, or at least remembers her being, and it's like, I'm gonna go there and find out for sure whether or not she wants to marry me. Now, in all reality, right, I mean, let's be honest with ourselves, guys, that's ridiculous. Like that's a ridiculous thing. I mean, I totally understand the pursuit of love. I understand, like I can't imagine a length that I wouldn't go to for Mariah, but at the same time, it's like society has collapsed. So like at this point, it's not even a matter of whether or not you want to go. The question is, how are you gonna get there? Right? I mean, it doesn't really even seem like he's thought any of this out, right? It's just like, I'm gonna go to Australia to find my girl. It's like, well, are you gonna swim? Because I can tell you right now, man, great white sharks are out there on the Australian coast, man, and they will eat your ass. So like, you gotta figure something out, man. You gotta do something, right? But it's one of these things where his mom's like, kind of like, no, like you have a duty, you have a responsibility to the world now. Like if you really are the last man out there, you have a responsibility to the world. And this is an interesting moral quagmire. Looking at the world as it exists right now, if something like this happened and the future survival of the human race rested on your shoulders, would you allow it to happen? Would you basically work as best you could to bring the human population up from the brink of extinction? Or would you say humanity's had its time? Like humanity has had its time now. I mean, look at what we did with the world, right? We procreate with reckless abandon. We've overpopulated it, pumped carbon into the atmosphere. Like we've done nothing but screw up ourselves and the planet. Maybe it really is time for humanity to go, right? Is that what you would do? Or would you take the philosophy, we're still capable of great things, we still have time here, right? Which one would you take? But ultimately, what ends up happening here, this is kind of the crazy thing, what ends up happening here is where I'm gonna leave you guys hanging, right? What ends up happening here is that while they're all talking, that ultimately Representative Brown tells her son, she's like, okay, look, I understand understand what it is that you want to do. I understand you want to go after your girl. You want to make sure that she's actually going to marry you and all that kind of stuff. And I can appreciate this pursuit of love. But more important than that, she's like, there are two people, or there is a person that you need to talk to, right? Like, we can do what we can to get you there, but there's a person you need to talk to. Her name is Dr. Mann, right? She is a bioengineer out of Boston, and supposedly she knows more about asexual reproduction than anybody alive. And so we're basically hoping that she'd help us create the next generation of females. But if you could find out what makes you immune, then that would change everything, right? Because at this point, the assumption has been there are no men left in the world, right? There's no men left anywhere. And so the traditional role of procreation is basically gone. Now, there is the idea of sperm banks, but one of the things that you actually end up finding out here is there is a group, and we'll actually find out more about them later. There's a group called the Amazons, right? Who are basically like this kind of really Christian fundamentalist group who believe that, like, you know, God wants all men to die, that it needs to stay that way, and that it needs to be a world full of women. And so they've actually been blowing up sperm banks to keep society from like recreating men, right? Bringing men back. But in the middle of all this, what you actually end up getting, well, it's not the Amazons. What you end up actually getting is just like this just explosion outside the White House, right? This colossal explosion. And when the question is asked by York, like, is it those crazy Amazon chicks? And the response of his mom is, no, it's not the Amazon chicks. It's much, much worse. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think about Y the Last Man down in the comments. I love this story, and I will catch you all later. Peace.